Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1700 to 1950, today we will talk about the foundation of the Indian National Congress, INC as it was popularly known. And as we know that before the emergence of the Indian National Congress, time and these organizations which were there at this point of time, they definitely played an important role in the context of the Indian national movement. And we find that the coming of these organizations was also as a result of the various kinds of grievances which the Indians felt against the colonial rulers. In that context, when we tend to understand the various kinds of organizations like the National Conference or the Madras Mahajan Sabha, which were established before the Congress, and how people from different sections of the society they became part of these organizations and raised their concerns. And there's a lot of debate also with regard to the foundation of the Indian National Congress. Some of the critics, they saw that it was the handiwork of the British, and how the British rulers, they wanted to create some kind of a safety valve after the revolt of 1857, and they felt that the Indian opinion should be known to the British, and if they will have a body which will inform them regarding the Indian opinion, so an occurring like the magnitude of the 1857 revolt should not happen in the future. So that was one of the concerns which was raised in the debates during that time. And also later we find that how the role of the Indian National Congress was there in the national movement, and it was also argued by some of the scholars that if the British, they wanted to use it as a safety valve, then the Congress used it as some sort of a lightning conductor. So in this particular framework, when one is talking about the various kinds of readings or references, one can talk about B.L. Grover's A New Look at Modern Indian History, Bipin Chandra's India's Struggle for Independence, Shekhar Bandyopadhyay's From Palasi to Partition, A History of Modern India. NCERT and IGNOU source material can also be used with regard to the understanding of the origins and the foundations of the Congress. We also see that the emergence of the Congress was in 1885, and before that a number of organizations, they also played an important role in that sense. And we also see that when one is talking about Congress, in that the contribution of A.O. Hume, who was a British officer, his contribution or his role is also being talked about. And when one talks about that how Congress over a period of time became one of the most prominent Indian public organizations and the largest public organization in that sense, and definitely it played an important role in the national movement as well. We find that when one is talking about the background to the founding of the Indian National Congress, we find that how over a period of time British, they became unpopular among the Indian population because of the kind of policies which they followed in India. And when you tend to see it in the framework of the revolt of 1857, we find that how during that time and even after that, British, they remained the perpetual foreigners, and how a lot of money was being transferred from India to Britain through the offices of the East India Company. So after 1857, we find that this kind of a change came where the British Empire took the direct responsibility of India. And the main purpose of the British rule after 1857 again was to justify its governance of India. And we find that how the English educated Indians, they were being utilized by the British, that how these Indians, they were familiar and friendly to the British culture and the political thinking as well. So they felt that how the English educated Indians, they would provide them all sorts of help to in a way establish or in a way consolidate the British rule in India. We also see that when one is talking about the foundations of the Congress, then a number of theories at that point of time, they gained prominence or ground. And when one talks about the contribution of A.O. Hume, who was working under the official direction of Lord Dufferin, so it was in a way connected with the idea of safety valve theory, that how the discontent of the Indians would be provided a constitutional and a safe kind of an outlet. And in this regard, a number of evidences, they were also being provided, in that sense that we find that the volumes of the secret reports, they tried to provide some kind of a proof of that time, which in a way was claimed that Hume claimed to have read them at Shimla in 1878. And there are scholars, those who have in a way criticized this kind of an argument and has argued that they were not authentic in that sense, because Hume was not did not have access to the Home Department files, because he was secretary to the Department of Revenue, Commerce and Agriculture. And it was also argued that files, they were kept in Delhi, they were not kept in Shimla, so it would have been difficult or rather impossible in that sense that Hume could have got access to these files. And it was also argued that the evidence of these 7 volumes of these files were shown to Hume by the gurus, and it was said to have possessed the occult powers who had been sent report by their disciples. So these kinds of arguments, they were being put with regard to Hume's access to these files, but they were also being rejected on the grounds that Hume did not have access to these files in a direct manner. Then we also see during this particular period that how Wedderburn's biography of A.O. Hume talks about the Banerjee's statement in the Indian politics in 1898 that Indian National Congress, as it was originally started and it has since been carried on, is in reality the handwork of Marquis of Dufferin and Hava. So this kind of a statement which was being given, it points to a kind of a fact that how it was in a way raised by the colonial rulers, and A.O. Hume was instrumental in its emergence, but at the same time Lord Dufferin definitely played an important role in terms of the origins of Congress. Then we also see that these kinds of ideas, they were also being propagated, that how, because he states that Hume was trying to bring the leading Indian leaders together to discuss the social matters, but Dufferin asked Hume to start discussing political matters so that the government could keep itself informed of the public opinion. So in that sense, it has also been suggested that how the Governor General or Viceroy was interested in knowing about the public opinion, and he wanted Hume's help in this regard, that not the social matter, rather the political matters or the politics should be discussed, so that British are aware about what was going on in India with regard to the organizations which were working for the Indian cause. And when we talk about the kind of happenings before the revolt of 1857, which were responsible for the revolt of 1857, so the discontent was an important concern at that point of time. And similarly, even when the East India Company was overthrown by the British rule, where the British rule assumed the direct powers, we find that the situation continued in the earlier manner, where we find that how Indian finances, they were being used by the colonial rulers or the British Crown for their own development. So this kind of a setting with regard to the usage of the Indian resources for the British was one of the important concerns of the Indians. And as we have seen that how the people, those who were engaged in agriculture, they were impoverished during that point of time. Various revenue settlements, be it the permanent settlement, Rayatvari settlement or Mahalvari settlement, all these revenue settlements, they were oppressive to the Indian population. The kind of revenue which they were paying to the British was also enormous. So this created a kind of a situation where we find that the agriculturalists, they were under a lot of burden of the revenue and rent which they were paying. And we also find that during the colonial period, the handicraft industry could not survive. In that sense, it crippled and it led to the deindustrialization in the Indian context, and which in a way also put a lot of pressure on the agriculture. We find that the people, those who had been displaced from the handicraft industry, they did not have any avenue to move to other sectors, so they shifted to the agricultural sector, which again created a lot of pressure on the agricultural sector. And when the agricultural operations, etc., they will find some kind of a depression, then it will also lead to all sorts of indebtedness as well. We also see, because of the colonial policies during this time, we find that India witnessed a number of famines in the entire 19th century, and poverty and starvation, they were the dominant themes of the 19th century, and the peasants, they were also discontented. In the framework, we find the Deccan riots of 1875. Apart from the agriculturalists, we also find that the tribals, they too were also suffering because of the British capturing of the forest resources, and we find that when tribals, they also started a number of protests because the kind of subsistence on which they were dependent on in terms of the agricultural produce was taken away by the British, and British increased the reserve forest areas for themselves. So all this created a kind of a situation where we find that the primary agriculturalist, for example, or the tribals, both of them, they were unhappy with the British policies. We also see in the context of the various sections of the society that how the capitalist or the industrial class was not given any kind of a tariff protection so that Indian industries could be protected. We also find that higher taxes, they were being realized from the Indian population, and we also find that even when the taxes, they were being collected, then there were a lot of cases of corruption and oppression as well. And we also see that the renewed agitation against the income tax in 1870, the taxpayers should know about the expenditure. So all these kinds of concerns, they were being raised at that point of time. We also see that at this point of time, the agitation on education, the government's decision to withdraw aid to the higher education in 1870. So people, they were becoming aware that how they have to in a way put a lot of pressure on the government, and we also find in Bengal organized agitations, they were launched, and we find that this agitation was a success. The government assured the public that no intention of withdrawing aid to the higher education was there with regard to the government. And we also see that the non-availability of the adequate employment opportunities for growing number of educated Indians, and how many of them, they took to law and journalism. So when these educated Indians, those who were there in these sectors, those who were now practicing lawyers, those who had become journalists and employed in the various newspapers, or they themselves have opened or initiated their own newspapers, so we find that they also came into they became aware in that sense, where we find that the ideas of nationalism, the ideas of getting rid of the colonial rule, all of them, they became important in their scheme of things. And we find that the colonial rulers, they did not mend their ways, the way they were functioning when the East India Company was ruling. They continued in the similar vein, and their racial approach towards the Indians, their exploitative methods, all of them, they continued unabated. And many of the measures which were taken by several viceroys or the governor generals, they were reactionary in nature, they were discriminatory towards the Indians. For example, Lytton, who was the governor general and a viceroy from 1876 to 1880, he talked about the removal of import duties on sugar so that it becomes cheaper and it can be easily sold in India. Then the expansionist war against Afghanistan, the expenditure of this war were thrown on the Indian exchequer, that how Indians, they had to bear the cost of the war, and all the gains which occurred due to the war, they were being given to the British. Then the Arms Act, which came during the Lytton's viceroyalty, we find that it intended to make it impossible for the Indians to offer any kind of resistance or even train themselves for defense. So we find that this kind of a discriminatory attitude towards the Indians was for all to see. And the way Indians, they were being treated through these various kinds of laws which were implemented by the successive governor generals or viceroys, they made them realize that they had to get rid of the colonial rule. In the similar vein, Lytton, for example, carried on with the Vernacular Press Act, and how this act sought to curb the growing criticism of the British rule by the press. And the vernacular press could not publish because of this kind of an act, and we find that a lot of pressure was created on the vernacular press, and the English press did not have this kind of a pressure. We also see that how they held the imperial darbar at Delhi, where millions of people, they were dying of famine during that time, and that point of time the imperial darbar, where the Queen was declared as the Empress of India, was being conducted. We also see that the direction of the maximum age of the competition for the ICS exam was reduced from 21 to 19 years, and it further reduced the chances of the Indians to enter the Indian civil services examinations, because we find that it was very difficult to compete in these examinations, because these examinations, they were held in Britain and they were held in Latin and Greek. So such kind of a learning was required to compete in these examinations. So we find that such kind of measures were inimical to the interests of the Indians, and Indians, they were being oppressed at all levels by the colonial rulers. And we find that the repeal of the Vernacular Press Act in 1881, where when this was being done, it convinced the Indians of the constitutional agitation, and they carried on with this kind of a scheme. In 1881-82, they organized the protest against the plantation labor and the Inland Emigration Act, which condemned the plantation laborers to serfdom. And in that context, another important development was the Ilbert Bill, which sought to empower the Indian civilians of the rank of a DM or sessions judge to try European offenders in Mufassil and the Presidency town. And the campaign against this bill by the Europeans and the Anglo-Indians took place, and bill was modified and a jury was added. So we find that Lord Ripon tried to bring about these kinds of reforms when he was the Governor General and Viceroy, but it was not liked by the Europeans, and we find that Ilbert Bill was repealed during that time, and jury was in a way placed, and this jury would have the majority of the Europeans. So all these kinds of things, they were trying to communicate the idea of European or British imperialism on the Indians, and Indians were also realizing in the new light that how education which had been imparted to them, and the various kinds of associations which were already there, and these associations, they were not all that broad based, they were narrowly conceived in terms of their program and the social base. So we find that new associations, they were being formed, and Surendranath Banerjee and A.M. Bose, they founded the Indian Association in 1876, and in 1883 the efforts to raise a national fund for promoting the political agitation in India and abroad, that was also being taken up, especially in England. And we also find that apart from that, other kinds of organizations, they also came up. Bombay Presidency Association in January 1885, earlier Madras Mahajan Sabha in 1884, and Indian Union in Calcutta in 1884, and Indian Association sponsored a national conference in 1883, but that attempt was not successful. So this kind of an idea, which was given a concrete shape by the nationalists in Bombay, who cooperated with A.O. Hume, and they assembled together in December 1885. So then they decided to start an all India kind of an organization, and they launched the Indian National Congress. So when one is talking about the development or the origins of the Congress, then when one is talking that it could only be attributed to a single individual like Hume would be incorrect in that sense, and to even assume that it emerged as a sudden effervescence, that suddenly the Indian National Congress emerged, so it was also a far-fetched thing, because we find that so many other organizations in the earlier part as well as being communicated to you as well. And we also see that these kinds of organizations definitely played an important role by creating this kind of a situation where people become aware that through their collective efforts they will be able to gain some kind of a ground in the context of their liberation from the colonial rule. And when these the people from different places, they became part of these organizations, and they did all sorts of brainstorming which was beneficial for the organization and for the country as well. So the foundation of Indian National Congress was only a visible embodiment of that national awakening which we see during this point of time. So in the context of the background, as we talked about that how the Congress definitely played an important role in the liberation of India, and how Congress as a political party was a dominant party at that point of time. And apart from that, we also see that the idea of safety valve, as it was being talked about, that Congress was just a safety valve, and how it was, and Congress used the British as some sort of a lightning conductor in that sense. So this debate is also unending in that context, whether it was a safety valve or it became a lightning conductor. So even if Congress got that kind of a support in the initial part, and the question of the moderates as well, that how the moderates their tendency or their attitude towards the British was such that they were referred to as mendicants, and because they believed in the sense of justice of the British. So we also have to see the kind of colonial context which was there at that point of time, and the people, those who were the participant in the Indian National Congress, they had their own limitations as well. And the initial part of the Congress, in that sense, when we find that from 1885 to 1905, that was the phase of the moderate politics, and thereafter the extremists, they take up the lead, and we find that during this particular period we also have some kind of revolutionaries, those who were gaining some kind of a foothold in Indian politics. And when Gandhi emerges, or when he comes to the scene, then we find that the period transforms into the Gandhian phase. So we'll talk about further about the moderates and their ideas with regard to the national movement, the kind of activities which were conducted by them from 1885 till 1905, and further in the next lecture. Thank you very much.